There is a recording. It exists in 17 classified archives across 4 star systems. The Council sealed it, redacted it, buried it under 11 layers of bureaucratic encryption so dense that our own archivists can't agree on what the original file size was. But recordings have a way of surviving the people who want them gone. I have watched it 432 times. I know, because I counted. It started as research. Then, it became something else, something I don't have a clean word for in my language. In theirs, I think the closest translation is obsession. Or maybe penance. The recording lasts 9 minutes and 41 seconds. In it, Fleet Admiral Vorexos of the Keth Dominion stands before the full Galactic Council, 312-member species, the most powerful deliberative body in the known galaxy, and proposes a full military strike on a small, wet, geologically unstable planet in the Orion Armorth. He has charts. He has projections. He has 17 subordinate officers standing behind him in dress uniform, all of them wearing the expression of beings who have rehearsed confidence so many times it has calcified into something unrecognizable. He speaks for 6 minutes. The council chamber is silent for the remaining 3 minutes and 41 seconds. Not the silence of agreement. Not the silence of consideration. The silence of a room full of the most powerful beings in the galaxy trying to decide whether or not the fleet admiral has lost his mind, or whether the humans have simply broken something fundamental about the way war is supposed to work, and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. I was in that room. I was taking notes. This is what I remember. My name is Thessaly Vor, and I have what my supervisor calls a documentation problem. What she means is that I write too much. What I mean is that she reads too little. This distinction has defined my career for the last 11 cycles, during which I have served as a senior council recorder for the Galactic Interspecies Deliberative Assembly, a title so long that even I, who invented the filing system for the institution's last 4 centuries of proceedings, abbreviated in my personal logs. I record things. Everything. Conversations, weather, the sound the ventilation makes on the south side of the assembly hall when the atmospheric pressure drops. I have a colleague, Drevik, who thinks this is a symptom of anxiety. I think it is a symptom of living in a galaxy where the things everyone agrees are impossible keep happening, and someone has to write it down before the powerful people in the room decide, collectively, that they didn't. I have 3 styluses on my desk at all times. I rotate them obsessively. First, second, third. Left to right, then, back again. When I'm nervous, I do it faster. When I'm very nervous, I don't notice I'm doing it anymore. By the end of Fleet Admiral Vorexos's presentation, I had worn a groove into the desk. He arrived at the 9th hour, assembly standard. The council session had been running since the 4th 7 hours of trade disputes, border reclassifications, 2 competing claims on a mineral-rich asteroid belt that both the Inari Collective and the Preth Hegemony were calling historic territory, which was rich, because neither of them had a history that predated the asteroid's formation. I had been awake since the 2nd hour. I had eaten a protein block that tasted approximately like regret, and I was on my 3rd cup of something the assembly cafeteria called stimulant beverage, and I called evidence that the universe is indifferent to suffering. I noticed Vorexos the moment he entered the delegates' antechamber, not because he was large Kether large as a rule, bipedal and dense, built like architecture that decided to become mobile, but because of the way his staff moved around him. Tight. Close. The specific geometry of people who are about to do something that might go badly and have arranged themselves for optimal political blast radius. I noted this. I rotated my stylus. Vorexos himself was unremarkable in the way that genuinely dangerous beings sometimes are. He had the file of a decorated officer, 4 major engagements, 2 border pacifications, 1 situation the official record described as stabilization of a contested region, and the unofficial record, which I had also filed, described as burning most of it down until the people left alive decided to agree with us. He wore his rank markers on his left shoulder, which is Keth for I earned these, as opposed to right shoulder, which is I was appointed. He had a data tablet in his hand and the expression of a male who had spent the last 6 months building a case and was prepared to be disagreeable about it. I did not, at that point, know what the case was. I found out when he spoke. The Council recognizes Fleet Admiral Vorexos of the Keth Dominion, the chair announced, on a matter of Tier 1 strategic concern. Tier 1. I stopped rotating the stylus. Tier 1 strategic concern is the classification used for existential threats. Rogue stellar phenomena. Resurgent hive mind incursions. The kind of business that clears the afternoon schedule and the next morning's breakfast. There are perhaps 47 Tier 1 declarations in the Council's complete history, and I have personally archived 39 of them, and every single one has been legitimate. Vorexos straightened. Placed his tablet on the podium. Looked out at 312 member delegates and the gallery above them, observers, staff, translators, recorders, one Drevik eating something that smelled aggressively of fermented seed pods, and said, with the cadence of a being who has rehearsed this, I am requesting authorization for a preemptive military strike on the Sol system. Silence. Not immediate silence. The kind of silence that arrives a half-second late, because the translation matrices have to finish processing and, then, everyone in the room needs a moment to confirm that what they heard is what was actually said. 312 delegates. Approximately 900 support staff. Every one of us arriving at the same destination from slightly different translation angles, and all of us landing in the same place. Sol system. Earth. I wrote the word down. Then, I looked at what I'd written and wrote it again, because my first attempt was shaky. The humans had been a known quantity for approximately 40 years of contact standard time. Known quantity is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Let me be more precise. 40 years ago, a Yanari long-range scout vessel made first contact with a human deep space probe in the outer reaches of the Sol system. The probe was not armed. It was not sophisticated by Council standards, primitive even, a canister with a recording inside, launched decades earlier, traveling on kinetic momentum toward nothing in particular. The Yanari recovered it, analyzed the contents, and filed an initial xenographic report that described the species as pre-contact, early spacefaring, biologically unremarkable, culturally stratified, unlikely to achieve faster-than-light capability within 4 standard centuries. This report won its author a commendation. This report was wrong about almost everything. Within 8 years of first contact, humans had reverse-engineered the basic principles of fold space travel from recovered debris, not debris we gave them, debris from a navigation accident in their outer system, a Preth cargo hauler that had miscalculated a transit and distributed itself across roughly 200 kilometers of asteroid belt. The humans had found the pieces, catalogued them with what I can only describe as disturbing thoroughness, and started building. Within 15 years, they had their first fold-capable vessel. Within 20, they had a fleet. Within 25, they had a small war with a Keth border garrison that had assumed a human vessel in contested space was either lost or an acceptable target, and the Keth garrison had filed a report afterward that used the phrase unexpected tactical flexibility so many times that my predecessor had flagged it for psychological review. That had been the first indicator. The second had been the Marin Corridor incident. The third had been the relief effort on Get His Station, which is still talked about in certain circles as the most structurally improbable rescue operation in recorded history. The fourth, fifth, and sixth had been various skirmishes, border provocations, and one memorable situation on the Keth frontier in which a single human squad had held a calm relay station against 6 rotations of Keth ground forces for 31 consecutive days, at which point they had apparently negotiated a ceasefire, which is a phrase that appears in the official record without any explanation of how they managed it, because the Keth commander who agreed to the ceasefire refused, on honor grounds, to ever discuss it. By the time Vorexos stood at the podium, humans had been a full member of the Council for 9 years. They had a delegation. An ambassador. A small suite of offices on the Assembly's eastern wing, which their staff had decorated with plants, actual biological plants, in pots, that the maintenance crew had initially tried to confiscate as organic hazards until Ambassador Chen had explained, patiently, that they were decorative. I had seen the ambassador's aide carrying a new plant through the lobby 2 weeks earlier. I had made a note. I make notes about everything. Vorexos had charts. Of course he had charts. They materialized in the air above the council floor, 3-dimensional projections, clean and bureaucratically precise, with the kind of label formatting that suggests someone on his staff had been working on them for months. Troop distributions. Territorial maps. Force vectors for a hypothetical multi-pronged approach on the Sol system's outer defense perimeter. Estimated conflict duration, 6 to 11 weeks. Projected casualties on both sides, modeled in 3 scenarios: conservative, moderate, and, what his staff had labeled, with a military special gift for euphemism, comprehensive. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He walked through the strategic case for 22 minutes. I transcribed all of it, because that is my function, and because I suspected that this particular transcript was going to be read by many people for a very long time. The argument, reduced to its components, was this: the humans were growing at a rate that the existing territorial agreements had not anticipated. In 40 years of contact, their population had expanded, their technology had accelerated, and their political will, their collective appetite for presence, for resource, for space in the literal and figurative sense, had not softened. The Kef Dominion held several systems adjacent to expanding human colonial zones. Borexos had projections showing that at current growth rates, within 2 generations, the zones of human habitation and Kef territory would overlap in ways that the existing treaties could not accommodate. Therefore, the argument went, it was better to act now, from a position of numerical and technological superiority, than to wait until the balance shifted. It was, I noted in my personal log and nowhere in the official transcript, the kind of argument that sounds logical until you think about it for more than 4 minutes. But it was not an illogical argument. That was the problem. It was a reasonable strategic case made by a capable officer who had looked at the data honestly and arrived at a conclusion that a reasonable being could arrive at. I rotated my stylus. First, second, third. Then, the questions started. The first came from Delegate Sathara of the Inari Collective, who is ancient enough that her species considers her a historical artifact and young enough that she still frightens junior delegates. Fleet Admiral, she said, and her voice had that particular quality of Yunari elders, dry, precise, carrying the specific weight of someone who has heard many catastrophically wrong ideas and is conserving energy for only the most catastrophically wrong ones. You've modeled 3 scenarios for this engagement. In your moderate scenario, you project a conflict duration of 8 to 10 weeks. I want to understand the assumptions behind that figure. Borexos nodded. His staff pulled up a secondary display. The projection accounts for their current fleet strength, defense infrastructure, and estimated ground force capacity. Does it account for the Get His Station operation? A pause. That was a rescue operation, Delegate. It was not. It was 37 humans who kept a station of 4,000 people alive and operational for 19 days with improvised systems after an infrastructure collapse, and then got all 4,000 of them out before the station failed entirely. I am asking whether your casualty models account for what happens when humans are told they cannot do something they need to do. Borexos's expression did not change. The scenarios are based on quantifiable metrics. That's what I thought. She sat down. I wrote, she sat down. Because sometimes the most important thing in a room is the precise moment someone chooses not to argue further, because they have already made their point and they know it. The second questioner was Delegate Mrak of the Preth Hegemony, who has a quality I find simultaneously admirable and exhausting, which is the willingness to ask questions that everyone in a room wants answered but no one wants to be seen wanting. Fleet Admiral. You're describing a preemptive engagement against a council member species. Against a species whose territorial expansion represents a significant strategic threat to against a council member species, Mrak said again, pleasantly. I want to make sure we have that on the record clearly. This is a declaration of war against a species currently represented in this chamber. The human delegation is not present for this. No, Mrak agreed. They're not. Their offices are in the East Wing. Do you want to estimate, for the record, how long it will take the information from this chamber to reach the East Wing? Another pause. Longer, this time. I wrote everything down. The third question came from a delegate I didn't recognize, one of the smaller member species, newly admitted, whose name I had to look up in my files before I could transcribe accurately. Delegate Vile, representing the Ashari Compact, a modest interstellar polity in the middle of a contested transit zone, which is the kind of position that teaches a species to listen very carefully before they commit to anything. Fleet Admiral. I want to ask about the Marine Corridor. Vorexos's posture changed. Fractionally. But, I have been watching beings give presentations in this chamber for 11 cycles, and I know what fractional posture changes mean. The corridor is a historical incident, 5 years ago, Delegate Vile said. Not particularly historical. The Ket's Second Expeditionary Force attempted to re-establish a territorial claim on the Marin transit lane using a blockade strategy. 3 weeks later, the blockade was gone. The official record describes this as, she checked her notes, a strategic repositioning in light of updated threat assessments. I'm curious what updated the assessment. That information is classified at the Dominion level, of course it is. She paused. I've spoken with traders who use the corridor. They have a different description. Traders are not reliable sources of strategic information. They said the humans used the fuel supply ships. She said it quietly, the way people say things they're not entirely sure they should say, but have decided to say anyway. The Keth blockade was relying on supply ships for extended operations. The humans didn't attack the blockade directly. They made the blockade's supply lines inconvenient. I've said the information is classified. I'm not asking for classified details, Fleet Admiral. I'm asking you to account for this in your projections. Because what you're describing is a direct engagement, and what I'm hearing from multiple sources is that direct engagement may not be the framework that actually applies to a conflict with these people. Silence. Not the first silence. Something different. The silence of a room reconsidering its geometry. Vorexos looked at his charts. His very thorough, very detailed, very confident charts. The scenarios are based on quantifiable metrics, Delegate Vile said. Yes. You mentioned. She did not sit down. She continued standing, which in Ashari body language is roughly equivalent to a raised eyebrow held indefinitely. I should describe, at this point, what I was feeling. I am a recorder. My job is to be neutral, which is to say my job is to feel things and, then, file them very precisely into the section of my mind labeled personal, not for official transcript. I have been doing this for 11 cycles. I am good at it. But, I had been following the human situation since contact, because it is my job to follow everything, and, somewhere in the last 8 years of cross-referencing incident reports and, flagging strategic assessments and, watching the human delegation's plans proliferate quietly through the East Wing, I had developed what Drevik calls a perspective on the matter. What I felt, watching Vorexos and his very thorough charts getting incrementally dismantled by a series of delegates who were asking the right questions without quite saying the thing they were all thinking, was something I can only describe in the Keth phrase, Grath Ven Salith, which translates, approximately, as the feeling of watching someone stride confidently toward a thing they do not yet understand is watching them back. I wrote that in my personal log. Then, I wrote, he hasn't accounted for any of it. Then, I wrote, he thinks this is a math problem. Vorexos recovered. He is a capable officer and a practiced political actor, and he had prepared for skepticism, even if he had not prepared for this particular quality of skepticism, and he pivoted to his strongest material, the projections. The numbers. The clear, quantifiable, modeled data showing that acting now, from a position of advantage, was the rational choice. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was wrong about the numbers being the point. But, this is a distinction that is difficult to make in a room where everyone is looking at projections, so he had, by the time he finished his presentation, recovered enough of the floor to leave the delegates with something that felt like a real choice, deliberate now, or table for the next session. The chair called a recess. I stood up. Rolled my stylus between my fingers. First, second, third. Drevik appeared at my elbow. He had, improbably, continued eating seed pods through the entire proceeding, and he offered me some. I declined. What do you think? He asked. I think, I said, that someone should warn them. The council? I looked at the East Wing corridor. The humans, I said. I think someone should warn the humans. Drevik ate a seed pod. That would be a significant breach of procedural protocol. Yes, I said. It would likely end your career. Yes, I said. He thought about this. What are you going to do? I rotated the stylus. First, second, third. I'm going to go get another cup of terrible coffee, I said, and think about how much I hate this job. Drevik nodded, which is the appropriate response. I went to get the coffee. I thought about it for the entire walk there and the entire walk back, and when I sat back down and the session reconvened and the chair asked whether any delegate wished to call for an immediate vote, I had made my decision. Which is to say, I had decided to keep taking notes. Very precise notes. Very complete ones. And, to make sure this particular set of notes was stored somewhere it could not be easily buried. Some decisions look cowardly until you understand that the pen or the stylus, as it were, is the only weapon you're actually qualified to use. I wrote that down too. The session ended without a vote. Vorexos's proposal was tabled for 3 days of deliberation, standard procedure for Tier 1 matters, which require review panels, independent security assessments, and at least one committee meeting in which nothing is decided and everyone leaves feeling they've done their due diligence. I filed my transcript. Both of them, the official one, carefully accurate, and the personal one, obsessively complete. As I was leaving, I passed the East Wing corridor. The door to the human delegation suite was closed. The light under it was on. I stopped. Someone on the other side was awake. I thought about the 37 people on Get His Station. The Marin Corridor. The Keth Garrison Report with its 17 uses of unexpected tactical flexibility. The blockade that had become inconvenient. I thought about the wall photograph the human ambassador kept on her desk. I'd seen it once, delivering documents of a blue planet, taken from very far away, pale and small and utterly unassuming. I kept walking. But I slowed down, first. Just for a moment. Just long enough to register that whatever happened next, it had already started. The review panel convened the following morning in Chamber 7. Chamber 7 is not the main hall. It is a small, poorly lit room on the Assembly's administrative level that smells of recycled air and the specific institutional despair of too many important conversations held in inadequate chairs. The ventilation makes a sound on the west side like someone tapping impatiently on a hollow wall. I have noted this in my logs 47 times. I have noted it exactly as many times as I have submitted a maintenance request, which tells you something about the relationship between documentation and action in large deliberative bodies. I was there because I am always there. Recorders attend all official proceedings, even the ones held in Chamber 7 with the bad chairs, even when Drevik has diplomatically suggested, again, that I might consider taking one of my accumulated leave days. I have 12 cycles of accumulated leave. Drevik considers this a problem. I consider it evidence that I have been present for things that mattered, and presence, in my experience, is rarely convenient. The panel consisted of 8 members. I will describe them briefly, because they matter. Delegate Sathara, Yunari, already discussed. Ancient. Precise. Delegate Mrak, Preth, already discussed. Pleasant in the specific way of someone who has decided honesty is their best political strategy. Delegate Vile, Ashari, the one who had asked about the Marin Corridor. Present with a researcher, a small one, who kept looking at her own notes and, then, looking at the wall with the expression of someone who has found something they're not sure they wanted to find. 3 other delegates I will name only by species because their individual contributions to the proceedings were limited: Hetari, Sorvain, and the Geth Confederacy representative, whose name I consistently misspell and have taken to noting only by the honorific Delegate G. And then, at the end of the table, 2 beings I had not expected. The first was Commander Rethavar of the Keth Strategic Intelligence Division, who was present, I gathered, because Vorexos had arranged for someone from his own apparatus to speak to the panel. Rethavar was younger than Vorexos, slimmer, with the quality of someone who operates in spaces where the metric for success is never being noticed. He had a data case. He opened it and arranged several items on the table: tablets, physical documents, one sealed container, with a deliberateness that felt almost ceremonial. The second was a human. I had not been briefed on this. I wrote, in my personal log, "There is a human at the table." Then, I wrote, "Why is there a human at the table?" Then, I stopped writing and looked at the human. His name, I learned later, was Sergeant First Class Daniel Ewan, and he was attached to what the human military called a liaison and advisory capacity, which is the kind of title that means something specific in context and nothing useful out of it. He was not in formal uniform. He wore what I have since learned humans call business casual, which is a phrase that sounds simple and is, in practice, a complex social signal about exactly how seriously someone is choosing to take a given situation. He was younger than I expected. Compact in the way of humans who use their bodies professionally. He had a coffee, actual human coffee, from a sealed flask he'd brought himself, because the assembly's stimulant offerings are, as I have documented, inadequate for most biological systems. He had one other distinguishing feature. He was taking notes. Not official ones. A small physical notebook, the kind humans apparently still use as backup documentation. Handwritten. He wrote quickly, without looking at the page, his eyes on the room while his hand moved. I recognized this behavior. I rotated my stylus, looking at him. He looked up, caught me looking, and gave me a small nod. Not the kind of nod that means I see you. The kind that means yes, I'm doing the same thing you're doing, and we both know why. I looked away. I wrote, "He's been in rooms like this before." I wrote, "He is not surprised to be here." Commander Rethavar opened the intelligence briefing without preamble, which I respected. This panel has been convened to evaluate the operational basis for Fleet Admiral Vorexos's strategic proposal. My division has been asked to provide an independent threat assessment. I will do so. He activated the first display. Current human fleet capacity, 217-fold capable vessels, categorized by class across this chart. Estimated ground force active strength, approximately 900,000 personnel, with reserve mobilization potential of 4 to 6 times that figure. Territorial extent of human colonial zones, here. He indicated the map. I had seen this map before, the Council's standard territorial overview updated it quarterly, but I had not, before this moment, seen it overlaid with Keth territorial boundaries at the scale that made the relationship between them viscerally obvious. They were close. Much closer than the abstract quarterly updates had made feel real. I wrote, "Why did no one mark it this way before?" Then, I wrote, "Because marking it this way makes it real." The Fleet Admiral's concern regarding territorial proximity is quantitatively valid, Rethavar continued, with the tone of someone who was about to make a significant qualification. However, my division's assessment of the operational risk differs from his proposal's assumptions in several respects. He moved to the second display. This is a compiled record of human military engagements in the last 25 years, indexed by conflict type, duration, and outcome. The display was large. The list was longer than I expected. Not all of them were engagements with Keth forces. Many were internal human conflicts, what they call regional disputes, which in practice meant wars between human political factions, the kind that species in early interstellar development still experience before political consolidation occurs. But, what Rethavar was indexing was not the fact of the conflicts. It was the pattern. Across 47 documented engagements, he said, including 17 with non-human military forces, human tactical behavior shows consistent characteristics that my division considers materially relevant to any assessment of operational risk. He highlighted 4 items on the display. I will transcribe them exactly as he stated them. First, adaptation velocity. Human tactical response to novel threats shows an average adjustment window of 6 to 24 hours. In one documented case, the adjustment window was less than 90 minutes. He did not specify which case. He did not need to. The Keth garrison reports unexpected tactical flexibility appeared in every experienced officer's memory like a bruise you keep pressing because you haven't processed it yet. Second, force multiplication through unconventional resource use. Human forces operating below optimal capacity consistently demonstrate an ability to leverage non-weapons systems, environmental factors, and opponent infrastructure in ways that render standard combat models inadequate. He paused. The Marin Corridor is the clearest example. Our modeling suggested a successful blockade given force ratios. The modeling did not account for the fuel dynamics. Delegate Vile made a small sound. Not a word. The sound of someone who has been waiting for something to be confirmed. Third, unit cohesion under extended stress. Unlike most species we have conflict data on, human unit cohesion does not degrade at the expected rate under resource deprivation, casualty accumulation, or prolonged operational duration. The baseline model for unit effectiveness over time shows a curve that, for human forces, is flatter than our predictive algorithms accommodate. Get His Station is an extreme example. It is not an outlier. Fourth, and I wrote this one very carefully, because of the quality of silence that arrived when Rethavar said it, information behavior. Human forces demonstrate an unusual pattern in how they process and act on adversarial intelligence. They are slower, in many cases, to receive complete information than forces with superior communication infrastructure. However, they appear to compensate with a decision-making process that is highly tolerant of incomplete data. They act on 30% of the information that Keth tactical doctrine requires before committing to a course of action, and their outcomes under these conditions are statistically equivalent. He stopped. The room was quiet. I looked at the human. He was writing. Commander Rethavar's fourth characteristic had a quality that I have been trying to describe accurately in these logs for a long time now, and I want to try again here, because I think it is the thing that the Fleet Admiral had missed, and it is the thing that, if I am right, the Council is still in the process of fully understanding. Most military doctrine Keth, Yanari, Preth, Hetari, most of the Council member species is built around information. The fundamental operating principle is, gather intelligence, achieve information superiority, then, act from a position of knowledge. The doctrine assumes that the entity with the best information wins, and, therefore the rational strategy is to accumulate information before committing. This is a sensible doctrine. I do not disagree with it in principle. But, it has an assumption buried inside it that no one had named out loud in that room yet, which is that your opponent is also waiting for information before committing. What Rethavar was describing in his careful, declassified, officially sanctioned phrasing was a species that didn't wait. Not because they were reckless. Not because they were impulsive. Because somewhere in their collective tactical history, they had learned, and I mean learned the way you learn something that rewires your behavior before you consciously decide to adopt it, that waiting for complete information in a crisis is just a slower way of losing. 30% of the information. Equivalent outcomes. I thought about what it would mean to be that on a galactic scale. Not just in one conflict. In every conflict. Against every opponent who was still calibrating their response while the humans were already in the fourth iteration of their improvised solution. I thought about this for a long time. I rotated my stylus and thought about it. Delegate Sathara had been silent for the entire briefing. When she spoke, it was with the tone of someone who has arrived at a destination that required a very long walk and is now going to say the thing that the walk was for. Commander Rethavar. Your assessment identifies these characteristics as materially relevant to operational risk. I want to be specific. What, in your professional judgment, does the Fleet Admiral's proposal fail to account for? Rethavar looked at his data case. Several things, he said. Name the most significant. The most significant, he said, slowly, is what the humans will do after the initial engagement. Silence. He continued. The Fleet Admiral's projections model a 6 to 11 week conflict. They model it based on our force superiority in opening engagements. This modeling is correct. We would win the opening engagements. He paused. The projections do not model what happens in week 12. Because, Delegate Mrak began. Because we don't have a model for week 12, Rethavar said. We have never fought a species that meets the combination of these four characteristics simultaneously. Our models are extrapolated from separate datasets. The human case combines them. He looked down at his tablet. And there is a fifth characteristic that my division did not include in the official display because it is qualitative rather than quantitative and, therefore, does not meet the threshold for official intelligence assessment. The room waited. What is it? Delegate Sathara asked. When human forces lose, he said, it changes the nature of the subsequent engagement. Not the tactics. The fundamental nature. He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. There is a behavioral pattern in their recorded history, not just recent history, their full recorded history as a species, in which significant defeats do not produce capitulation. They produce a quality that my division's cultural analysts have not been able to accurately map to existing frameworks. He stopped again. What do they call it? Delegate Vile asked. In their own literature, which my analysts reviewed extensively, the closest available term appears in multiple historical contexts. They call it getting even. The room was very quiet. I wrote down every word. This is the point at which the human, Sergeant Ewan, spoke for the first time. He had been quiet for 2 hours. Taking his notes. Drinking his coffee. Maintaining the specific stillness of someone who was present as a courtesy or a formality and has understood since walking in that the courtesy or formality is more complicated than it appeared. He did not raise his hand. He did not request recognition. He simply said, in a conversational tone that should not have carried in the room and, somehow did, "Do you want me to save you some time?" Everyone looked at him. He looked back. Not aggressively. Not with any particular emphasis. With the patience of someone who has spent significant portions of their career waiting for rooms to arrive at conclusions that he arrived at much earlier. Sergeant, Delegate Sathara said, after a moment. I know I'm here as an observer, he said. I understand that. I'm not trying to speak for the delegation or the government or any of that. He turned his coffee flask in his hands. I'm here because the ambassador asked someone from our military advisory group to sit in on the review, and I drew the short straw. What would you like to add? Delegate Rack asked, with the pleasant tone that meant this is either going to be interesting or I'm going to need to redirect the proceedings. Ewan thought about it. The commander is right about week 12, he said. He's right about all 4 characteristics. The 5th one is the one that usually surprises people, but, honestly, it's not even the one I'd be most concerned about. He paused. Can I ask a question? The delegates looked at each other. Delegate Sathara made a minimal gesture that meant proceed. The projections model the conflict as a linear engagement. The Kef Dominion applies force, the human military responds, the engagement reaches a conclusion. He turned the flask again. Has your intelligence division looked at what happens to the human civilian population during an extended military conflict? A pause. That data was not included in the primary assessment, Rethavar said carefully. Okay. Ewan nodded as if this confirmed something. Because that's week 12. It's not a military problem, at that point. He looked at the territorial map still displayed on the wall. How many humans are currently in the Sol system? Approximately 9 billion, Rethavar said. Yeah. He looked at the map for another moment. 9 billion people who have access to significant industrial infrastructure, who have a cultural relationship with war that goes back to the literal beginning of recorded history, and who have been watching very closely while you've been discussing this. He finally stopped turning the flask. We're a young spacefaring species. We're still learning how this all works. But we've been fighting each other for a very long time, and the thing about that is, we got good at it. He picked up his notebook, tucked it away. I'm not saying this as a threat. I'm saying this because the ambassador asked me to observe and, I think the honest thing to do with an observation is report it accurately. He looked at Delegate Sathara. Fleet Admiral Vorexas's proposal accounts for the military problem. It doesn't account for what comes after the military problem fails, and it will fail at some point, because every military problem eventually fails, and then, what you have is 9 billion people with an industrial base, a long memory, and, he found the word carefully, a particular attitude about losing, He stopped. "That's the observation," he said. He picked up his coffee. In the silence that followed, I noticed that Commander Rethavar had not looked at the human while he spoke. He had been looking at his data case. And, now, in the silence, he closed it. Not with the motion of someone who has finished presenting. With the motion of someone who is doing it so they have somewhere to put their hands. I have been taking notes in rooms like this for 11 cycles. I know what it looks like when an intelligence officer has just heard a civilian say the quiet part out loud. The recess was called at the 11th hour. I stayed in my seat while the room cleared. I watched Sergeant Ewan stand, exchange a few words with Commander Rethavar, very brief words, the tone of which I couldn't hear, and then leave through the side corridor, his notebook back in his jacket pocket. I thought about week 12. I thought about 9 billion. I thought about the word even, deployed in the very specific context of a species that had been building weapons out of whatever they had for as long as they had records of themselves. Then, I thought about the Fleet Admiral, still somewhere in this building, with his charts. His very thorough charts. His confidence. His timeline of 6 to 11 weeks. I wrote, in my personal log, the thing I had been refusing to write for 2 days, which was this: the Fleet Admiral is not wrong about the math. He is wrong about which math is the math that matters. Then, I wrote, the math that matters is, how many of them are there, and how long does it take the ones who are left to stop? Then, I wrote, because I am thorough and I believe in complete documentation, I don't think anyone in this building, including the human, knows the answer to that second question. I'm not sure the humans know either. I'm not sure that makes it better. I rotated my stylus. First, second, third. Then, I packed my bag and went to file my notes somewhere very safe, under a very long encryption string, in an archive that I am the only one who can access. Some recordings need to survive the people who would prefer they didn't. This was becoming one of them. On the third day, it rained in Sector 11. This is irrelevant. The assembly complex is sealed, climate-controlled, maintained at a temperature range that accommodates the majority of member species with acceptable tolerances for the outliers. Weather does not enter. But, I know it rained because I arrived early and walked through it getting from the transit station to the main entrance, and I am documenting this because it is the detail I remember most clearly from that morning, the smell of it, wet stone and electrical charge, the specific gray of a sky that hasn't decided what it's going to do yet. I was carrying my fourth bad coffee. I had not slept well. This is also irrelevant. I document it anyway. The full council session convened at the 8th hour. 312 delegates. The gallery, which for the review panel had been mostly empty, was at capacity. Word had moved, not officially, not through any channel I can trace, but word had moved. The public gallery observer applications for that session were 3 times the standard daily volume. I noted this in my official log and also wrote, in my personal one, everyone knows something is happening. The human delegation was present. This I had not expected, and I wrote it down before I had fully processed seeing it. The human delegation is present. Ambassador Lena Chen was seated in the human delegation's assigned row 7 seats, which is the standard allocation for member species of their size and tenure, and which the human delegation had never previously used more than 3 of. Today all 7 were occupied. The ambassador was in the center seat. She was wearing formal diplomatic dress, which for humans appears to mean dark clothing in specific arrangements that signal seriousness, and she had the posture of someone who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing it. I did not see Sergeant Ewan. I did not stop looking until I was confident he was not there, and then I stopped, because what his absence meant was obvious, and I did not need to write it down. He was somewhere else. Doing something else. In the way that military advisors who have sat in on intelligence briefings and, then, departed quietly through side corridors are often somewhere else doing something else in the 48 hours before an important vote. I chose not to speculate further. I have learned, in 11 cycles, that the things you choose not to speculate about are frequently the things that were already handled before you started worrying about them. Fleet Admiral Vorexos entered the main chamber at the 7th hour and 43rd minute mark. He was alone. No staff. No presentation apparatus. His rank markers on his left shoulder, I earned these, and a single data tablet, which he placed flat on the podium and did not activate. He looked different. I wrote, he looks different. Then, I tried to be more precise, because imprecision is a failure of documentation, and I arrived at this: he looked like someone who had received new information in the last 48 hours and was still in the process of incorporating it. Not shaken. Vorexos was not a being who was easily shaken, and his career was built on the specific Keth military quality of controlled resolve under pressure. But there was something in his bearing that had not been there 3 days ago. Not doubt, exactly. Recalibration. The chair called the session. The agenda, as read: deliberation and vote on the Keth Dominion proposal, reference number Tier 1 Delta 77, submitted by Fleet Admiral Vorexos. The floor was opened. The first delegate to speak was not Sathara, or Mrak, or Vile. The first delegate was a being I have filed under Delegate Jeeth, the Geth Confederacy representative, whose name I continue to misspell, who has, in my 11 cycles of service, spoken precisely twice in full council session. Not because they are disengaged, but because the Geth approach deliberation the way experienced surgeons approach an incision: wait until you are certain, and then be brief. They stood. I would like the record to note, they said, in their precise and somewhat formal translation, that the Geth Confederacy's position on this proposal has been filed through official channels and does not require additional explanation here. A pause. However, I would also like the record to note, and I ask the recorder to mark this as a Confederacy formal statement, that this proposal represents the first time in the Council's history that a member has formally proposed preemptive military action against another member during an active period of joint governance. We consider this fact to be of separate and significant importance, regardless of the proposal's outcome. They sat down. It was 14 seconds. I wrote every word. Ambassador Chen had not moved during the Geth statement. She had been still, with the particular quality of stillness that is not passivity but control. Now she turned to the delegate on her immediate left, one of her own staff, and said something in a low voice. I was not close enough to hear it. I wrote, she said something. Which is, I acknowledge, barely documentation, but the fact of it mattered: she was paying attention to the Geth statement in a way that the rest of the session had not required her to externalize. I thought about what she knew. She was the ambassador. Which means she had received the same information the review panel had. Which means she had received Rethavar's 4 characteristics, and the 5th one, and the question about Week 12. Which means she had heard what her own military advisor had said to the review panel. Which means she had 48 hours to decide what she thought about all of it. I tried, very briefly, to imagine what those 48 hours had looked like, and then I stopped because it made my ventral organs do something uncomfortable. Vorexos was recognized by the chair at the 20-minute mark. He stood. He did not activate his tablet. The Keth Dominion thanks the Council for its deliberation, he said. We have received the review panel's assessment and the independent intelligence briefing. We have also received, through our own diplomatic channels, several communications over the past 48 hours that have contributed to our understanding of the full scope of this matter. He paused. I rotated my stylus. The Dominion is withdrawing its proposal. The silence was complete for 2 seconds. 3. Then, the chamber dissolved into the specific noise of 312 delegates, 900 support staff, and a gallery at capacity, all beginning to process information at slightly different rates. It is a sound I cannot easily describe except to say that it is unlike the silence that had followed the proposal's introduction, and unlike the silence in Chamber 7, and unlike any of the other silences I have documented in 11 cycles of service. It was the sound of a room exhaling. Vorexos spoke through it. This withdrawal does not reflect a change in the Dominion's assessment of the strategic landscape. The concerns that motivated this proposal remain. The territorial dynamics remain. The question of how the Council intends to address the specific conditions that generated this proposal, that question remains. He looked, for a moment, at the human delegation. Not aggressively. Not with any particular intensity. The look of someone recording a fact. We expect that question to be taken up through appropriate diplomatic channels, and we request that the Council schedule those discussions accordingly. He picked up his tablet. That is all. He stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. I looked at Ambassador Chen. She was still. Her expression was the expression of someone who was choosing, with considerable precision, not to have an expression. Then, the delegate to her left said something, and she turned, and, for the brief moment before her professional composure re-established itself, I will try to be precise. It was not relief. Relief is what you feel when a threat passes. This was something different. It had the quality of a confirmation. Like she had placed a very considered bet on something uncertain, and the uncertainty had resolved the way she had calculated it might, and now she was doing the internal accounting of what that meant. I wrote, she knew. Then, I wrote, or she expected. Then, I stopped, because the distinction mattered and I wasn't sure which it was, and imprecision is a failure of documentation, and I was not prepared, in that moment, to document something wrong. The session did not end there. Delegate Sothera requested the floor. With the proposal withdrawn, she said, I would like to address the concern the Fleet Admiral named, because he is right that naming it and withdrawing a proposal are not the same thing. She was recognized. The Council has spent 3 days examining a situation that exposed several gaps in our existing frameworks. The review panel received intelligence that we did not have adequate models for. An observer from the human delegation contributed an assessment that my institution lacked the analytical context to have generated independently. She looked at Ambassador Chen. Ambassador, the Inari Collective would like to formally request, through appropriate channels, a consultation process regarding territorial framework development. Not as a response to this proposal. As a response to the fact that our existing frameworks were developed before the human membership, and have not been substantively revised since. Ambassador Chen held her gaze for a moment. The delegation accepts, she said. It was 4 words. They were said with the precise neutrality of someone who has been prepared for this exact sentence. I wrote them down. After the session, in the corridor outside the main chamber, I saw something that I want to include in this document even though it does not belong in any official record, and even though the relevant parties might prefer it not be noted anywhere. Vorexos was walking toward the exit. He was not moving quickly, he had nowhere to be, the day's critical business being concluded, the decision made. He was moving at the pace of someone with thoughts they are choosing not to rush. Ambassador Chen was coming from the opposite direction. The corridor is wide enough for 2 beings to pass without acknowledging each other. This is, I believe, by design. Many things pass in that corridor without acknowledgement. They stopped. I was close enough to watch. Not close enough to hear, but close enough to watch, and watching is also a form of documentation. Vorexos said something short. 2 or 3 words. Ambassador Chen looked at him for a moment. She said something back. Equally short. Then, they both continued in their respective directions. I do not know what they said. I wrote, they spoke. Because even without the words, what I can document is this: it was not hostile. It was not warm. It was the specific quality of 2 beings who understand each other in a particular way, not fondly, not comfortably, but accurately acknowledging that fact. There is a Keth word for this, which Rethavar had used in a different context in Chamber 7, Vorith, which translates roughly as the respect between opponents who have correctly read each other. I wrote that in my personal log and not the official one, because it is an interpretation and not a fact. But I believe it. I found Drevik in the cafeteria at the 14th hour. He was eating seed pods, because Drevik is invariant in several respects, and he had, in front of him, what appeared to be an extensive personal document that he closed when I sat down. Well, he said. Well, I agreed. He ate a seed pod. He withdrew it. Yes. I didn't expect that. I'm not sure he did either, I said. Not 3 days ago. Drevik considered this. What do you think happened? I got my coffee. The cafeteria's stimulant offering of the day was something labeled Restored Blend, which tasted approximately like the third stage of grief. I drank it anyway. I think, I said, that someone in the Keth Dominion did the math that Rethavar was gesturing at in the panel and came to a conclusion the Fleet Admiral didn't like. Which math? Week 12, I said. Drevik nodded slowly. And the 48 hours. What happened in the 48 hours? I thought about this for a moment. About Sergeant Ewan leaving through the side corridor. About the ambassador and her 7-seat delegation row, all occupied. About the communications Vorexos had referenced through our own diplomatic channels and the careful way he had said it. I think, I said, that the humans made some things clear. Quietly. Through appropriate channels. I drank my terrible coffee. I think they told the Dominion what they were willing to do in response to an attack, and I think when the Dominion ran the numbers on that, the 6 to 11 week model started looking like a significant underestimate. Would they have actually done it? Drevek asked. What they implied they'd do? I thought about Rethavar's fifth characteristic. I thought about getting even. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't think anyone does. I think that might be the point. Drevek ate another seed pod. That's terrifying, he said. Yes, I said. As a strategy, I mean. Yes, I said again. It is. And it worked. We sat with that for a moment. The cafeteria ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The day was ending in the way important days end, which is with a great deal of paperwork and the strange feeling of having witnessed something whose full meaning will take years to understand. I stayed late to finish my logs. Both of them. The official transcript, complete and accurate. The personal one, obsessively so. When I was done, I did something I have not done before in 11 cycles of service. I sent a copy of the personal log encrypted, routed through 3 non-standard archiving systems to a secure external repository that is not affiliated with the Assembly, the Council, or any member species government. It is a private service. It is expensive. I paid for it from the salary I have been accumulating across 11 cycles of never taking leave. It felt, when I did it, like finally spending money on something that mattered. I packed my bag. I rotated my stylus one last time. First, second, third. Then, I put it away. On the walk out, I passed the East Wing corridor again. The light was still on in the human delegation suite. I stopped. This time, not to register that something was beginning. This time because something had to for today, for this version of the crisis, resolved. And, I am a recorder, and I believe in documenting not just the events but the moments between them, the moments that don't generate paperwork, the moments where the weight of something settles into the floor and you have to just stand in it for a second before you can walk on. A planet, pale blue. 9 billion. Week 12. I stood in the corridor for approximately 4 seconds. Then, I walked out into the rain, which had not stopped. The sky was still that particular gray. Still undecided. The recording exists. 432 viewings. I stopped counting at some point. The number stopped being the point. What I know, having watched it that many times, is this: the 9 minutes and 41 seconds of Fleet Admiral Vorexos standing at the podium is the part everyone focuses on. The proposal. The charts. The confident arithmetic of a being who has decided that the math is sufficient. But, the part one return to the part that keeps me watching is the 3 minutes and 41 seconds of silence that follows. 312 delegates. 900 staff. A gallery at capacity. Every single being in that room sitting with the same unspoken question. Not can we do this? The room had already figured out can we? The question was the one Sergeant Ewan had named in Chamber 7, quietly, over a flask of coffee he'd brought himself because the Assembly's offerings were inadequate. What happens after? What happens after is still being written. I am still taking notes. I expect to be for a very long time.